NBC's sitcom The Office is widely known as a relatable but hilarious show with often exaggerated situations and awkwardly deadpan humor. Its influence is spread across media platforms with a pop culture following rivaled by little else. But what makes this show so relatable when it is designed to be a caricature of a real workplace? The uniquely human traits demonstrated by each of the characters and the impact they have on the wacky situations around them. Each of the characters is still very human, and this becomes abundantly clear as you watch through the series. Each one of the actors portrays a distinct set of personality traits which drive their influence on various situations. This becomes quite clear in Season 2's episode entitled Conflict Management. In this episode, Michael, the boss, finds out that the human resources manager has not been doing his job of resolving office conflicts. As Michael hilariously tries to fix everyone's problems, a salesman named Jim is forced to deal with his own conflicts in different ways. Both Michael and Jim are forced to deal with the conflicts in their daily lives, but because of their distinct personalities, they go about it in very different ways. Michael and Jim demonstrate different characteristics which help or hurt them in dealing with people. To figure out exactly what some of those characteristics were, we looked at the series of traits known as the 5-factor model of personality, or the Big Five. We believe all of the Big Five traits demonstrated by each of the episode's 2 major players affect the outcomes of the interactions with others.
One of the Big Five personality traits we can see in the episode of The Office is openness. According to a 2015 study called Bounded Openness, low openness can be associated with intolerance of other people and their ideas. Low openness can be seen in the character of Michael in this episode of The Office. Michael shows his lack of openness in this episode when he takes matters into his own hands with Toby's work. Rather than accepting Toby's way of handling things, he decides to do things his way and labels Toby's way as bad. Another example of Michael's low openness is when he is trying to solve the t-shirt conflict. He shuts down Pam's idea for a solution almost immediately after she gives it, and then he credits his own idea as the best. He is not truly open to anyone's ideas but his own. Michael certainly seems to show a lot of intolerance for his office having any sort of unresolved conflict by suggesting that he himself would help with each and every complaint. This reveals his low openness to anyone else's ways of managing conflict in the office.
Conscientiousness, by definition, is competence, order, dutiful achievement, striving, self-discipline, and deliberation. It is also having an awareness of yourself and others, and how the two are affected and correlated. Through the observations of the characters Jim and Michael, Jim has a higher level of conscientiousness in comparison to Michael. Throughout the show, Jim is fully aware of the people around him and also his actions and how they affect others. Michael deliberately misunderstands people in the context of his surroundings. He also shows a high level of incompetence. Specifically, in the Conflict Resolution episode, Toby is in charge of listening to the employees' complaints and filing them accordingly. Michael shows immense incompetence by breaking employee policy, fighting his human resource representative for the complaints, and then finally continuing to read each individual complaint out loud. This only results in a negative effect. However, and at the end of the day, conflicts aren't resolved or they are solved in an ill-mannered way. The conscientious level of an individual can affect many aspects of their lives. From the article Conscientiousness, Health, and Aging, conscientiousness stands out as a striking predictor of health across the decades of life. Associations between conscientiousness and diverse aspects of health are surprisingly given that conscientiousness reflects constructs of deliberative, self-controlled, and goal-directed behaviors, including impulse control, planning, and delay of gratification, orderliness, and propensity to follow social norms. We see a difference in a few of these aspects of conscientiousness between Jim and Michael. Jim shows a higher level of self-control and impulse control in the way he resolved his conflict by redacting his statement in the first place about Pam, and then later confronting her when an employee takes the fall for him in a calm and apologetic manner. In contrast, Michael disrespects his human resource representative to get his way, and ultimately he selfishly made conflict in his workplace much worse because of his actions.
Extroversion is the next trait in the Big Five that is characterized by exhibiting higher levels of sociability, talkativeness, assertiveness, and excitability, while introverts will have lower levels of this trait. According to research, introverts are way more likely to internalize problems and think through them, while extroverts do not mind taking their problems to others for discussion and guidance because they are more willing to express themselves openly and make clear their preferences or choices. Michael presents higher levels of extroversion because in the episode he takes charge of all the complaint files and decides to mediate them until they are gone. His reason for doing so is because he sees the office as his friends and family and not just as his employees. He is vocal about the conflicts people have against each other, and he makes it his goal to resolve them all by the end of the day by taking initiative to mediate them. According to research, in conflict, it is the dominant, forceful dimension of the trait that comes into play, as extroversion has been related to a preference for both dominance and competition as conflict resolution strategies, and the tendency to approach versus avoid arguments and to be argumentative. Michael does, in fact, become dominant in the situation of trying to resolve the conflicts within the office by being forceful towards Toby by taking the conflict files from him. When it comes to conflict resolution skills, people with lower levels of extroversion usually make decisions based on emotions rather than logic. In relationships, they're warm, caring, and although they can be spontaneous, there is thoughtfulness behind every impulsive act. Jim presents himself with lower levels of extroversion due to his inability to be upfront about his problem with Pam planning her wedding at work, as he is afraid of hurting her feelings. He makes no arguments, rather he makes decisions based on his emotions, not on what might be the most logical solution. At the end of the episode, Jim reevaluates his decision to pull more pranks on his coworker and eventually decides to move forward and step away from the conflicts with Dwight and Pam by transferring to a different location, as he thinks this will help resolve those conflicts.
The next personality trait described by the Big Five is agreeableness. According to Funder, the trait has also gone by the names conformity, friendly, compliance, likability, and warmth. All of these adjectives can communicate a pretty effective understanding of what falls under the category of agreeableness. People who demonstrate high levels of this trait show greater compassion, politeness, and, as much research would show, generally avoid conflict. While agreeableness is certainly not the most prominent trait of Michael or Jim, it plays a big role in how each of them deals with tricky situations. Jim displays some very high levels of agreeableness in his interactions with his coworkers. Throughout the series as a whole, he is personable, friendly, and genuinely seems to show some level of care for those people around him. Even in the conflict resolution episode specifically, it is a notable theme of his personality. Jim listens intently to Pam as she vents about her problems, yet still tries to put the best construction on her conflict, noting that the complaint against her was redacted. He tries to maintain a cheerful demeanor for the rest of the office in the face of all the complaints. Finally, when he realizes Dwight is actually hurt by all the pranks he concocts, he actually feels bad and reevaluates the necessity of doing more. Research shows, however, that agreeable people tend to report less, be involved in less, or avoid more conflict than others. A 2011 research study by Remus Illies, published in the Journal of Organizational Research, found that people high in the agreeableness trait will tend to attract less conflict because they seek harmonious relationships with others. This also lends itself to agreeable people trying to avoid conflict when it arises. Jim avoids conflict at several points during the episode. He walks out of the room when he hears Pam planning her wedding so he could avoid the problems. He also considers transferring to a different branch by the end of the episode because he wants to get away from his conflicts with Pam and Dwight. Michael, on the other hand, shows a surprising lack of the agreeableness quality. Where he sees conflict, he tackles it head-on. When he fights with Toby, he addresses it directly, which goes against what a 2002 study by Joyce Bono found that agreeable people do. The study found that people with high levels of agreeableness tend to report less conflict. Michael calls out several conflicts over the course of the episode, which ultimately makes him much better at solving the issues.
The final personality trait in the Big Five is neuroticism. Neuroticism is characterized by abnormally high levels of anxiety, hostility, depression, self-consciousness, impulsiveness, and vulnerability to stress, according to Costa and McRae, cited in Funder. Individuals who score high in neuroticism on the Big Five personality inventory are more susceptible to experiencing these negative emotions. Funder also notes that those high in neuroticism complain a lot about nearly everything, which is interesting given the central plot point of this episode. By that definition, Dwight could be the poster child for neuroticism, but for this assignment we will continue to focus on the personalities of Jim and Michael. A study conducted in 2015 by Mendiburo Sigwell regarding humor and personality found that aggressive and self-deprecating humor styles are related to higher levels of neuroticism. Humor influences the relations we establish with others, and can serve as a form of aggression or as a coping mechanism, or even both at the same time. We see examples of neuroticism through humor in Jim's incessant provoking remarks and pranks on Dwight. Jim is generally a quieter, more reserved character who often appears cool, calm, and collected, but his neuroticism is shown in this particular episode as he starts to realize how unprofessional and immature his pranks make him out to be. His anxiety, emotional instability, and uncertainties come to the surface as he begins to explore the possibility of transferring to another branch of Dunder Mifflin. The desire to transfer is also a result of the ongoing tension in Jim's relationship with Pam. At this point in the series, Pam is engaged to a man named Roy, though there is an ongoing romantic chemistry between Pam and Jim. Highly neurotic individuals are often jealous, and this is the case for Jim, though he tries not to show it. As Pam shares some of her pre-wedding distress with Jim, he asks what her fiancé thinks, and she replies, "I don't know. I try not to bother him about this kind of stuff." Jim says, "You mean like your thoughts and feelings?" Pam says, "Yeah." The conversation is dropped, but it is clear from Jim's nonverbal cues that he is unimpressed with the lack of intimacy that Pam and Roy share. He acts on his feelings for Pam rather impulsively as he complains to Toby about her planning her wedding during office hours, and though he doesn't intend for it to be filed as an actual complaint, it ultimately comes out in front of the entire office. While Jim exhibits some neurotic tendencies in his insecurity and jealousy, they are nothing compared to the neuroticism of his boss, Michael. Sociologist Kimball Young summarizes some of Dr. Karen Horney's theories on neuroticism as he states that one way a neurotic individual may attempt to satisfy their interpersonal needs is through extreme self-assertiveness, witnessed in almost obsessive urges for power, prestige, and possessions. Michael exhibits that exact obsession with power as he attempts to resolve every conflict in the office, not for the sake of bettering the lives of his employees, but for the sake of being the hero that has total control of the situation and is always right. Michael is extremely vulnerable to stress as he cannot handle working in an environment where his employees are fighting, and asserts his dominance over them by fixing their relationships. "It pains me to see all of the negativity festering," he says, but he demonstrates no real depths of concern for the individual problems. His self-consciousness is masked by grandiose delusions of overconfidence, falsely believing that none of the complaints have ever been about him.
After watching the episode, one might notice how differently Michael and Jim handled the conflict situations, and consequently, how well each of their conflicts were resolved. For Michael, everything was forced out into the open, and his coworkers were forced to confront their problems directly. Jim waited until the last minute to try to resolve his personal conflicts, and it backfired, causing him to try and flee to a different branch. According to a large body of research, the certain personality traits they each had affected the way they dealt with the situations. Michael's lack of openness, agreeableness, and conscientiousness make him very difficult to work with in the episode, and looking at the articles about personality and conflict, it makes sense why he dealt with the issues in that brash, apathetic manner. Jim's dominant traits of conscientiousness, agreeableness, as well his low levels of extroversion and neuroticism contribute to the avoidant stance he takes to his own conflicts, an idea backed up by the research we found. After examining the research and comparing it to the traits shown by Michael and Jim, it is unsurprising that the episode unfolded as it did.